I always wanted to join the army. Began when I was aged 10, and I had a cousin in the Territorial Army who was in the 3rd County London Yeomanry. And they were at the TA annual camp with their horses in 1934. And I thought this was tremendous. And I formed the ambition then, which I pursued later, to become a soldier. So when it came to the start of the war in 1939, I and, in fact, quite a lot of my contemporaries at school were dead worried that the thing would be over before we had a chance to join in. I think, looking back, of course, we had no idea what a war was like. That came later. There were several different routes into the army in those days, and the first route, which was the one I chose, was to go to university, where I had been offered a place, and to join the Officer Cadet Training Unit, and then to sign on for 5 years with the colours and 7 with the reserve. Then immediately to be transferred to the reserve, which gave me a year at Oxford before I was called to the colours and actually joined the army. But of course, we were all members of the Officer Cadet Training Unit of the university, and we were obliged to qualify by passing Certificate B of a fairly low level of military competence. It was only after that I then actually started my formal training, which culminated in passing out at Sandhurst. Incidentally, it was General Eisenhower who took the passing out parade when I left Sandhurst, so I count that as a privilege, except that he made a rather curious remark. He finished his speech to us, which was very good, by saying, "See you on the Rhine." Well, D-Day hadn't happened then, and we all knew perfectly well that a subaltern's life was between 3 and 6 weeks long. So being invited to see him on the Rhine became a matter of some doubt in our minds. We were sealed off in a camp in Hampshire. And then we moved in trucks to the old Royal Naval Barracks in Portsmouth. And then we marched along the front to Southsea. And all the way along were these special piers reaching out. And the landing craft came in nose first, bow first. And then you marched down the gangway and boarded. And we got on board. The whole regiment was split between 4 landing craft. And so one of these had the whole of the squadron I was in. And then the landing craft went out and anchored in the Solent, and a convoy formed up to cross over to Normandy. This is a long time after D-Day, which is in mid-July. And when the convoy was formed, somebody tooted on a hooter, and the whole lot then set off. It was a very uncomfortable night. I couldn't find anywhere to sleep which wasn't occupied by sprawling bodies already. So eventually I and a chum settled for the ammunition lockers round a 20mm anti-aircraft gun. But unfortunately, the knobs of the ammunition lockers kept on. Every time you rolled over, you were jabbed somewhere in your body by yet another of these protuberances. And so it was a great relief when we saw the dawn come up, and suddenly there we were outside the Mulberry Harbour and sailing between these enormous concrete caissons, which took up the slack of the waves coming in. And we then disembarked onto a thing called a Rhino ferry, which then ferried us to the shore. And we actually didn't get our feet wet. I mean, we stepped straight off the Rhino ferry onto the beach. Oh, it was a mass of activity. I mean, there were on the water, there were dozens of little craft, pinnaces and small landing craft, all buzzing about. There were much larger landing craft, disgorging heavy vehicles and tanks. There were other landing craft disgorging ammunition and petrol and rations, and all the logistics required to keep an army going. And all this, so it was a hive of activity afloat, and it was a hive of activity ashore, because there were either vehicles driving off their landing craft, or there were troops like ourselves coming ashore on these Rhino ferries. The Rhino ferries would also take some of the vehicles as well, but ours were only occupied by bodies. And there were beach masters ashore who were trying to direct traffic, because there was a very complicated system in Normandy of traffic circuits throughout the whole beachhead. And actually, once you set off, you were in a circuit, and you couldn't actually get out till you got back again if you were in a vehicle. And we marched off the beach up a long slope, and we finally finished up by a little fly sheet from a tent under which there were two splendid chaps from the Royal Army Service Corps who had a whole line of petrol burner cookers and these enormous Dixies on each of them. And they fed us with hot tea. It was a very hot summer's day, and we were actually fairly parched at that stage. So anyway, we had this tea, and we had biscuits and bully beef issued. And we then went and sat in an orchard. And that was fine. And the afternoon wore on. And eventually dusk came, and we all settled down to sleep wherever we were. And, oh yes, great drama. Yes, very excited. I mean, you felt part of a great machine grinding away. You have to remember the old adage about war. There's 95% boredom and 5% acute fear. And there's always an awful lot of waiting about goes on. Thank heavens, there were a number of older men who were experienced soldiers, and had many of them had served in my regiment in the Dunkirk campaign. So they actually knew about the reality of war, and thank heavens for that. But the rest were very young. I mean, my tank gunner, was only 20. But my tank driver, who is now aged 88, he was a very experienced soldier who had served since 1939. I personally never found this at all difficult. I think probably the answer to your question is everyone knew what the chain of command was. There was the commanding officer, lieutenant colonel. I had a squadron leader who was a major. And then there was me and my contemporaries, the troop leaders. Now, when an operation was impending, we would receive our orders from the squadron leader. We would gather round at the back of his tank. He would then say, "This is what you're going to do." We'd then go back and tell our troops what they were going to do. And I think I don't remember any difficulty. Perhaps a sideline to this is it's very peculiar in a tank, and it only happens in a tank, and that is that the turret crew can actually look up and see the expression on your face. Now, if you suddenly see something absolutely dreadful, your jaw drops, you can affect their morale. So you learn a little bit of sort of acting skills. So however dreadful what you're looking at, you try and preserve a completely dispassionate, cool exterior to it. Yes, well, in action, of course, one hopes that there'll be some let-up in which one can dismount and spend a penny. Where this is not possible, we actually everybody did this, we actually used the brass shell cases. Because every time you fire a round, you get an empty case pushed out of the breech of the gun. And so those provide a way of coping with that. We always kept a few rations within the turret and down below, because down below was the driver and the co-driver sitting in their seats. And we always kept a whole lot of good old-fashioned biscuits, hardtack, I think the Navy would call it, and tins of sardines. And they would provide what I think Mr. Ray Mears now persists in calling nutrients. I call food. And, you'd have snacks during the day. You wouldn't have a proper meal until late at night, when the regiment, the squadrons, etc., pulled back and went into harbour. There's a very famous quote from an officer's confidential report, which said about a mythical officer, the only reason his men follow him is out of sheer curiosity. I hope the survivors of my troop, still a goodly number, I'm glad to say, that they would feel that it wasn't curiosity, that they followed my lead, because they trusted me. I think you have to establish a measure of trust with the people you lead. If they think you're going to lead them into trouble, watch it, because they will not do what they're required to do. But I don't think I suppose the real answer to your question is the remarkable quality of the regimental spirit. People are more worried about letting their comrades down by anything they do or fail to do than they are by what the enemy are throwing at them. And while that balance remains, then there's no problem. But you have to display, of course, some reasonable degree of military competence and not be an idiot. They look after one another. We all looked after one another. I suppose the best example was actually later in the Normandy campaign, when in fact outside a little French overgrown village or small town called Bourneville, and my troop were told to go forward and reinforce another squadron which had already got through the village. And off we went. And we came over a crest, and I could see the tanks of the other a troop of the other squadron on my left, tucked into a hedge. What I didn't know at that particular moment was that we were in the sights of some German anti-tank guns about 1,000 yards away. Anyway, the first thing that happened was a frightful clunk, and my driver reported no power, no gears, nothing. And in fact, I then gave the order to bail out because there was no point in staying in a vehicle which couldn't do anything except be brewed up. And we all got out and we all took refuge by a little crucifix. Now, the camaraderie comes in with the behaviour of the two rear tanks. We were advancing what was known as two up, two in front and two behind. And the rear tanks immediately came forward and gave heavy covering fire to enable us to get back, which we did thankfully, without any casualties. I suppose the feeling I had was one of, and likewise my crew, feeling of intense relief that we were still on God's earth. What happened to us after going to sleep in the orchard was we were moved around. I don't think actually anybody knew quite what to do with the regiment, because we had been alerted by rear headquarters, 21 Army Group, to take the place of a regiment which at that moment was still fighting. And so we were shoveled into trucks and moved to a rest area where the officers' mess was in an abandoned piggery, and the other ranks slept in a barn. And we actually worked in the Armoured Reinforcement Group tank park, getting tanks ready for action, because they arrived cased in grease and that kind of thing, or lacking sights. And we did all this for a few days, and then finally the decision was taken, and we were told to take our place in the 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats. And we then moved south and joined 22nd Armoured Brigade, who were the armoured brigade of that division. And immediately we were involved in an operation to push south of Villers-Bocage, which was a critical point. And we were headed down towards Montpinçon, which is a very dominating feature from which first the Germans and then ourselves, after we captured it, could look down to an immense spread of country and could bring, of course, artillery fire, mortar fire, etc., onto anybody. Well, the Bocage, yes, to give some idea of what conditions were like, the Bocage country is rather like South Devon. So they're very narrow lanes with high, thick banks and thick hedgerows on top of the banks. And the fields are comparatively small. So anybody advancing, for example, into the Bocage country really didn't know what was going to happen next. Anybody, either an enemy tank or the wielder of a handheld anti-tank weapon, Panzerfaust it was called. Anybody with these weapons could be lurking round every corner. The moment you shoved your nose round, they'd blast you to kingdom come. So it was a bit hairy. And though a troop leader wasn't supposed always to lead from the front, it was clearly unfair to expect the troop sergeant or the two troop corporals, the other two tank commanders, to be in the lead all the time. It began to look as if you were sheltering behind them. So one had to take one's turn, and that really was quite a thing, which caused a few flutters in the heart. To be under attack is, of course, first of all, very frightening, mainly because, particularly in Normandy, it was so difficult to see where the enemy was. You would see the after effects, and the German army was incredibly adept at fighting a defensive battle. They had, after all, been doing that for several months, if not 18 months, already on the Russian front. And they would fire at one if it was their armour, their tanks. Then the dreaded 88 millimeter was the key thing of which we were all a bit scared, because our tanks were not up to it in terms of protection. And an 88 millimeter round would go straight through a tank, taking nearly everybody with it. The other great weapon which the Germans used, or the other weapons, I should say, were the mortars. They were called Nebelwerfer, and they actually looked like a little trailer with a whole lot of little barrels sticking out of it. To be under attack and unprotected, which was basically what we looked for in our tanks, but for a harbour area or a company area, in the case of the infantry, to be deluged with these mortar bombs was fairly scarifying. Last of all, when you're closing with the Germans, then the Spandau machine gun was their most fearsome weapon. It had an extraordinarily high rate of fire, well over 600 rounds a minute. That's 10 rounds a second. And so dealing with these various forms of attack or protecting oneself against them was quite a business. As far as the tanks were concerned, we would obviously camouflage our tanks simply by hanging bushes over them. But of course, the infantry, all on their feet, sometimes were not all that keen on having tanks moving around amongst them because of the way they attracted mortar fire and machine gun fire. But the fundamental difficulty, particularly in the Bocage country, was finding out where your opponent was, doing something about him. Much later on, towards the end of the war, I was commanding a troop in the same squadron, and during an attack to clear the Germans out of a small town near Osnabrück, I was injured by machine gun fire in the late afternoon when I was actually trying to get my troop into position to support the leading infantry company. So I was walking down a lane to find the company headquarters, followed by my tank, rather like a tame dog, and behind that would be the other tanks in the troop. And so there was a sudden burst of fire, and I felt a great blow on my leg and found I couldn't stand up anymore. So then I knew something had gone wrong, and my tank, I was actually quite worried that my tank would run over me, because by that time it was almost completely dark. And I shouted like mad. Anyway, they stopped, and my crew got out and put me on the back of the tank and took me back to squadron headquarters. And from then on, I was in the medical chain. I had a problem, not unusual, because remember, these were in the early days of antibiotics and sulfur drugs and so forth. And in fact, my wound became infected. By this time, I was back in a hospital in Brussels, and my wound became infected. So what should have been relatively simple, and I should have been back at duty in about a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, became, in the end, about 9 weeks. But before that, I was able to go on leave in England. I think the worst is the loss of particular friends. I can think of 2 or 3 people who were marvelous people, and they were killed. And it's the sense of loss. There's a famous story about the Duke of Wellington after Waterloo, that his adjutant general came to him with the list of casualties. And the Duke read through this list and eventually broke down in tears and said, "My God, perhaps there is one thing only worse than defeat, and that's the cost of victory." And I look back to all my comrades who now lie buried in France and in Holland and in Germany itself. And it's very sad. Young lives which they gave willingly for their country. And one particular friend of mine, for example, who was already married and had a little daughter, and he never saw the little daughter. Oh dear, yes. I try and encapsulate the effect of World War II. I think one has to look at the way people thought at the time, not post de facto now, but at the time. And I think all those, the professional soldiers, the hostilities-only soldiers, and the officers, all wanted to finish the war as quickly as possible and get back to normal life. But we knew that the war was a necessary war. We knew, everybody knew in all 3 services, that to allow the Nazi tyranny to flourish was the end of everything, for us and for all the peoples in Europe. And though, of course, young men particularly, we don't get too highfalutin about great dedication to a lofty ideal. What actually moves ordinary people under these circumstances is they mustn't, under no circumstances, let down their comrades. So people will be brave, and usually are, to avoid that, to avoid being categorized as one who lets his comrades down. Now, if we pull those thoughts together, we see a picture of, if you like, determination by people to finish the war, determination to get rid of the Nazi tyranny, and to see normal life resumed. I don't think anybody had any idea how long it would take after the war for that last state to be realized.
And how did the
war change me personally? What a difficult question. I think perhaps 2 things. First of all, it taught me the value of the comradeship of a regiment, the regimental system in the British Army. This is a unique way, so that 60 years on, people are still looking after one another. Old comrades still have arrangements to visit other people who are possibly bedbound or whatever now. That's the first thing. So the value of comradeship would be the first big thing that I got out of the war. I think the second thing, courage enough, was the impact of leadership. I'm not just my own leadership, but the people around me, my squadron leader, my commanding officer, who's an extremely able tactician. There are many old comrades of my vintage in my regiment who say probably he by the quality of his decision making and the quality of his insight into armoured warfare actually ensured that we survived. And so leadership is the big thing. Oh, the third one, I think, which is very relevant, alas, today, is the equipment of the three services. Without first-class equipment, and we had very moderate tanks in World War II, without first-class equipment, it's very difficult not to have quite unacceptable casualties in war. Casualties, alas, I mean, like the need to break eggs in order to make an omelette. Casualties are bound to occur, and one mustn't get too carried away by the thought that war might be fought in the future by aliens pressing buttons. It's much more brutal than that, and more immediate. But that will be my third thing.